Imagine a country that, in just 3 decades, transformed from a closed-off, agrarian economy to becoming the second largest economic power in the world. It's the greatest economic rise in human history, a true economic miracle that caught the attention of nations everywhere. We're talking about China, the Asian giant that has experienced astounding growth and now plays a central role in global trade. But, like any meteoric rise, it's not without its major challenges. Today, China finds itself at a pivotal moment in its economic journey. Over the past 30 years, China's growth has been nothing short of explosive, fueled by internal reforms and its opening to the international market. Millions have been lifted out of poverty, and the country became known as the world's factory, with a pace of development that once seemed unstoppable. However, this rapid expansion happened while China was still in an early stage of development, with plenty of room to build its production base and capitalize on cheap labor. Now, with a much more advanced and diverse economy, China faces a new challenge, the so-called middle-income trap. This theory suggests that once a country reaches a middle level of economic development, around $12,000 in per capita income, growth starts to slow down. The engines that drove the initial boom, like low wages and fast productivity gains, begin to lose their power. Chinese President Xi Jinping, aware of the vulnerabilities of an economy heavily dependent on exports, has been working to shift toward a model more focused on domestic consumption. This move became even more urgent after events like the 2008 financial crisis and ongoing trade tensions with the United States, which exposed the risks of relying too much on external markets to sustain growth. The idea is to build a stronger base of domestic consumption that can withstand global shocks and keep the economy stable, even in times of international turbulence. When we look at China's economy, it's clear that it relies far more on investment and exports than on domestic consumption. A significant part of this investment is in the real estate sector. China has been pouring money into construction, leading to several nearly empty cities, often referred to as ghost cities. With the real estate sector highly leveraged and facing structural problems, China is hitting the limits of growth driven by excessive investment and needs to find new ways to boost domestic demand. A key comparison to make is between the US economy, which is driven by consumption, and China's economy, which is fueled by investment. This comparison helps explain how each country handles slowdowns and recessions. While the US relies on a rebound in consumption to get back to growth, China faces the challenge of scaling back unnecessary investments and encouraging domestic consumption, which still makes up a smaller share of its economy compared to exports and real estate. The transition from an investment-driven economy to one focused on consumption is always marked by challenges. While China has lifted millions out of extreme poverty, wealth distribution remains highly unequal. Large urban areas like Beijing and Shanghai have a growing middle class ready to spend, but in rural and less developed regions, purchasing power is still limited. Another major hurdle is the lack of a strong social safety net. Unlike many developed economies, China hasn't fully implemented comprehensive public health, pension, and welfare systems that provide long-term financial security for its less affluent citizens. Without these protections, Chinese families tend to be cautious. Rather than spending, they save a large portion of their income for retirement or potential emergencies like medical expenses or education for their children. This limits consumption and keeps the national savings rate high, which in turn slows the development of a stronger consumer market. The Chinese government has rolled out policies to encourage spending, such as tax cuts and credit incentives, but these efforts haven't been enough to change the deeply ingrained savings habits of the population. Consumer confidence remains tied to concerns over economic instability and the lack of social protections. So, for China to successfully shift to a consumption-driven growth model, it will take more than just short-term economic incentives. Boosting domestic demand is undoubtedly one of the biggest challenges for China's economic future. The government will need to strike a balance between reforms that increase people's disposable income and policies that provide greater financial security. Without this, the country risks a sharper slowdown as export-driven growth loses steam and domestic consumption fails to expand fast enough. Another key point to consider is that China, once the poster child for rapid economic growth, is now facing a period of slowdown. Growth rates that used to soar above 7% per year have dropped to around 2.5%. This highlights the challenges the country is grappling with, showing that its economy needs time to adjust and stabilize before it can bounce back to stronger growth. One of the major hurdles is its demographic profile. The working-age population is gradually shrinking at a rate of about 0.5% per year, largely due to long-standing policies like the one-child policy. These measures have slowed population growth, leaving China with a growing worker shortage. Unlike other countries that rely on immigration to counter declining labor forces and maintain population growth, China tightly controls its borders, making this solution impractical. Mass immigration is virtually non-existent in China, largely due to restrictive policies driven by both cultural and national security concerns. On top of that, many skilled workers and professionals opt to migrate to Western countries, like the US, in search of better opportunities and greater freedom. To grasp the depth of China's demographic crisis, it's important to understand how the one-child policy, along with cultural factors, has shaped the current situation. A simple calculation illustrates the issue. Imagine 4 grandparents, under the one-child policy, have 2 children, and those 2 children only have 1 grandchild. This means that 4 grandparents, who would have once had several descendants, end up with just 1 grandchild. This drastic drop in birth rates creates an inverted pyramid effect, where fewer young people are responsible for supporting a growing elderly population. The impact of this decline is twofold. First, it directly hits the workforce, with fewer people of working age to drive economic growth. Second, it puts immense pressure on the healthcare and pension systems, as more elderly people rely on these services, while the shrinking workforce contributes less to these systems. With an aging population and a historically low birth rate, China is facing a situation where the economic burden on public finances and families is mounting. China's demographic situation presents a major challenge for the country's economic future under Xi Jinping. Without significant reforms, such as improving productivity through technology or creating incentives to boost the birth rate, maintaining growth will be tough. The government has already begun taking steps, but the results have been limited so far, underscoring the complexity of the issue. The Chinese economy is currently facing significant inefficiencies, especially when it comes to the relationship between investment and GDP growth. To generate just $1 of GDP, China now needs to invest around $8. This is a stark contrast to the days of rapid growth, when only $4 of investment were needed to achieve the same result. This shift highlights an economy that, despite decades of fast expansion, is now struggling to maintain that pace of growth. A large portion of this investment has gone into infrastructure projects, building roads, airports, and other massive developments. While these initiatives were crucial for China's development in the past, many are now seen as overbuilt. In several regions, these structures are underutilized or fail to deliver the expected economic returns. A prime example of this is the real estate sector, where speculation has fueled a dangerous bubble. In China's real estate market, many people have purchased properties solely for their appreciation in value, without any intention of using or renting them. This has led to entire cities filled with empty buildings, so-called ghost cities, a clear sign of oversupply and an unsustainable market. This real estate bubble is now one of the country's biggest economic challenges, with the government facing the tricky task of deflating it without triggering a wider crisis. President Xi Jinping seems well aware that continuing to invest heavily in real estate won't bring long-term benefits. The Chinese government understands that fixing this issue will take time, including reducing its dependence on real estate as a growth engine and finding more sustainable ways to drive the economy. However, this transition is going to be delicate and will require careful management to avoid a sharp collapse that could ripple through other sectors of the economy. 5. The growing debt. In addition to the economic slowdown and inefficiencies in investment, another major challenge facing China is its growing debt. Since the 2008 global financial crisis, China's debt has been increasing at an alarming rate. Back in 2008, the country's debt was around 150% of its GDP, but by 2023, that figure had surged to 275%. This spike reflects the government's attempts to prop up the economy through massive infrastructure projects and stimulus measures, which haven't always delivered the expected returns. A clear example of this is the real estate sector. To keep the economy growing, many Chinese people bought properties hoping they would rise in value, with the government supporting this through favorable credit policies. But this has led to a real estate bubble, with thousands of vacant properties and entire ghost cities, where buildings stand empty, offering very little return on investment. This situation mirrors Japan's real estate crisis in the 1990s, which led to a lost decade of economic stagnation after years of booming growth. High debt isn't just a growth challenge for China, it's also a hurdle in the country's transition to becoming a more developed economy. Nations like Brazil and Mexico have faced similar struggles in trying to break through the middle-income barrier. Both accumulated significant debt, which limited their ability to make strategic investments and stifled long-term growth. These examples show how excessive debt can be a major roadblock for countries at this stage of development. To tackle this issue, China will need to focus on restructuring sectors like real estate and improving investment efficiency. The government has recently adopted policies aimed at tightening credit to prevent a deeper crisis, while also trying to boost domestic consumption to lessen reliance on massive infrastructure projects. However, these adjustments will take time, and debt will remain a key factor that could constrain China's future growth. On top of rising debt, China also faces the significant challenge of an aging population. The long-enforced one-child policy, which was in place from 1979 to 2015, has led to a shrinking workforce that is already impacting the economy. With fewer people of working age and more retirees, there's growing pressure on the country's pension and healthcare systems. This creates a scenario where costs related to healthcare and pensions are likely to rise rapidly, putting further strain on government resources. This demographic issue is exacerbated by the speed at which China's population is aging. By 2050, it's estimated that around 30% of China's population will be over the age of 60. This shift directly impacts economic growth, as the workforce that once fueled China's industrial boom is shrinking by 0.5% each year. With fewer workers available, improving productivity per worker becomes critical to keeping the economy moving. The Chinese government has recognized this threat and is focusing on encouraging technological innovation and boosting productivity as a solution. Advances in fields like artificial intelligence, robotics, and automation are seen as ways to offset the declining workforce, increasing efficiency throughout the economy. In addition, China has introduced measures aimed at encouraging families to have more children, but the success of these policies remains uncertain, and the short-term challenges persist. The demographic challenge also has an impact on China's debt. As the costs of supporting an aging population rise, the government will have fewer resources to invest in other vital areas needed for growth. This means China will need to carefully balance funding for social programs with the continued investment in innovation and infrastructure necessary to keep its economy competitive. While China grapples with an aging population and a shrinking workforce, the situation in India is quite the opposite. With a young and rapidly growing population, India stands to benefit from what's known as the demographic dividend, where a majority of the population is of working age, providing a large and youthful workforce. Unlike China, where healthcare and pension costs are escalating, India still has time before it faces these challenges. This positions India well to attract investment and drive economic growth, especially if it invests in education, skills development, and technological infrastructure to fully capitalize on this opportunity. In addition to demographic challenges, China faces another significant barrier to population growth: the high cost of living. In recent years, the cost of education and healthcare has skyrocketed, putting pressure on young families and discouraging new families from forming. For many young Chinese, the cost of raising children has become prohibitive, further exacerbating the country's demographic crisis. This situation is exacerbated by the shortage of women, a direct consequence of the one-child policy, which has resulted in a cultural preference for sons and, consequently, a gender imbalance in the population. Housing has also become an important factor in this equation. Property prices in major Chinese cities have risen to levels that are unaffordable for many young people. This problem is particularly evident in metropolises such as Beijing, Shanghai and Shenzhen, where high property speculation has made the dream of owning a home unattainable for many. With the difficulty of purchasing or even renting housing, many young people are delaying or avoiding starting families altogether, which has a direct impact on birth rates and population growth. These high living costs, combined with an aging population and gender imbalance, create a vicious cycle that makes it even harder to reverse the demographic crisis that China is facing. To address this, the Chinese government will need not only policies to encourage birth rates, but also measures to make education, health care and housing more accessible to a young population that is feeling increasingly economically pressured. China is trying to reposition itself in strategic sectors such as electric vehicles and chip production, but it faces significant obstacles. In the electric vehicle sector, the country has flooded the global market with low-cost models, which has boosted its exports. However, this strategy is already facing resistance in some regions, especially in Europe. European countries have begun to discuss possible barriers to Chinese electric vehicles, concerned about unfair competition and the safety of their own automotive industries. This resistance reflects an attempt to protect their manufacturers and avoid over-reliance on Chinese products. In the chip sector, the situation is even more delicate. China relies on advanced technologies from the United States and other countries to produce next-generation semiconductors. However, restrictions imposed by the United States, which prohibit the sale of advanced technologies such as ASML lithography machines and NVIDIA chips, have limited China's progress in this sector. These barriers directly affect China's efforts to become self-sufficient in semiconductor production, an area critical to technological development and digital sovereignty. Furthermore, China has been exporting large quantities of steel and copper, indicating that domestic production is in excess of domestic demand. The large-scale export of these products suggests that the country is facing limited domestic demand, forcing companies to seek foreign markets to sell excess production. This imbalance between domestic production and consumption indicates that, despite rapid development, China is still struggling to adjust its economy to a stronger consumer base while dealing with overproducing industrial sectors. Although China has experienced impressive growth in recent decades, predictions from 10 or 15 years ago that the country would surpass the United States in GDP by 2020 have not come to fruition. This is due to the obstacles China faces, such as an aging population, rising debt, and slowing economic growth. Today, with growth projected at around 2.5% per year, the reality is that China may not overtake the United States until 2060, especially if the US maintains stable growth. This is directly linked to the challenges already discussed, such as the rising cost of living, the difficulties in boosting domestic consumption, and global constraints on strategic sectors such as electric vehicles and chips. Although China has long been seen as one of the world's leading emerging powers, there are currently many uncertainties about its ability to maintain the rapid growth pace of recent decades. The Chinese stock market, for example, has been virtually stagnant since 2007, a clear reflection of the lack of confidence among domestic investors. This reality is directly linked to the country's economic challenges, such as rising debt, an aging population and an inflated real estate sector, which have hindered a consistent recovery. China's economic policy, focused on growth through high investment, follows a pattern already seen in other Asian countries, such as Japan and South Korea, which also focused their expansion on large investments in infrastructure and exports. However, this model reaches its limits when domestic demand does not keep up, which makes the economy increasingly dependent on continuous investment for growth. Without a strong consumer base, this cycle becomes unsustainable, as has been seen in other Asian economies. Furthermore, the Chinese government has been working to defend its currency, the renminbi, which appears to be overvalued, while keeping tight control over interest rates. This suggests that the Chinese economy is biding its time to recover, similar to what happened to Western economies after the 2008 crisis. Rising interest rates have a significant impact on the housing market. This is reflected in major recessions, which had their roots in the collapse of this sector. When interest rates rise, borrowing becomes more expensive, and the real estate sector is the first to feel the impact, due to its high reliance on credit. This slows down sales and construction, which leads to layoffs in the construction sector and related areas, such as building materials and furniture. This cascade effect follows a vicious cycle. Rising interest rates reduce demand in the housing sector, which results in fewer jobs and income, which reduces overall consumption, causing more layoffs. This cycle is only interrupted when the government or the central bank steps in with economic stimulus to reverse the situation, which is what China has sought to do. The path ahead involves a delicate transition. China will need to rethink its reliance on infrastructure investment and exports and start focusing on stimulating domestic consumption and technological innovation, in order to find new ways to maintain its economic relevance on the global stage. And if you liked this documentary, watch the next one right now that we will leave here on the screen.